presented 2 or 3 possible other developments that could have taken place on that lot prior to Royal, and explained in detail why those developments could not have worked, or why those developers backed out prior to them presenting a plan to build Royal. And we talked about and asked for details on all the other things that we asked. I don't know what you're planning on calling it, but this car wash. And I mean, if you're only using that dollar value to say that there's a hardship on this, I mean, that's a problem. But the fact that you're leasing or tenant space in that mall, and I go by there all the time, so I'm well aware of the turnover and what's been in there, what's not in there. I didn't know 60%. I would have said 70 or 75%, but I knew it wasn't 100%. And you can't fight the economic times of today. I mean, I get packages delivered to my house 3 times a day, I think, sometimes. So I understand that dilemma as well. So you can't mail order a car wash, at least not yet.
Well, yeah, Amazon might come up with something, but in the meantime, we'd like to do it.
Yeah, I don't think that the sewer line repositioning was that big a percentage of the whole case in any event. So while it's an interesting point, 5% of the cost involved in the $500,000 that they've got sunk into this.
Well, an empty lot on Ridge Road for almost 20 years. Ridge Road's the best we got, Webster. It's a busy road. I mean, if they haven't had offers from, corporate franchises for that location, to me, that's an indicator that there's an issue. So, would somebody like to go through the use variance standards?
I actually do not have my copy with it.
We don't get a lot of use variances, but I'll go through the standards.
I need it back, though.
I'll get you a new set.
No, thanks.
First one is applicant will not be deprived of all economic use or benefit of the property. I think we've established the history of that property since 2004 and the occupancy, tenant space percentage. And I don't personally believe that if you built or expanded that plaza that you'd be having people that were jumping through flaming hoops to rent that space. So I think you comply with the first one. Hardship relating to the property is unique and does not apply to a substantial portion of the neighborhood. And we talked about it. I mean, if you're just on the north side of Ridge Road, you could build that and comply with, and wouldn't need a use variance there. This request does not alter the character of the neighborhood. We already established that there is a car wash on Ridge Road just to the east. Every variance, I agree with Don on this, every variance is self-created to some degree, but based on the history presented, you made a case of why the board should entertain granting a use variance going all the way back to 2004. Difficulty can be obtained, or obviate. That's a word. Obviated. By another feasible method. I don't know if I ever read that word before. Not that project. Not a project of that scope. I mean, a car wash has morphed at least 3 or 4 times since it was first presented, and now it doesn't need any variances other than a use variance. Character in the neighborhood, like I said, you could build that without coming for a use variance right to the north side, right across the street. So I think we've established that. And the health, safety, and welfare of the community will be protected. I don't see a concern there, so. At this time, I'd like to make a motion to grant a use variance to be located at 801 Ridge Road to allow the construction of a car wash business within the Webster Woods Plaza on a 1.24 acre parcel having SBL number 079.17-1-85 located in a MC medium intensity commercial district under section 225-17 of the Code of the Town of Webster.
Second.
Mr. Denoto?
Aye.
Mrs. Bolo?
Aye.
Mr. Hauser?
Nay.
Mr. Barone?
Aye.
You forgot one.
Mr. Schneider?
I'd like one.
Aye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, you've got your use variance now. I assume you're gonna get started on this. Soon you gotta get through the planning board, obviously.
We need our
and
site
planning
plan
board's
approval.
is going to really have an eye on traffic. I know they will. So, hopefully we won't see you back for more variances, as you indicated with
I
your
hope so.
variances.
But I hope to see you all again soon, and this is where I'd shake all your hands and say thank you, but I'll avoid that and just say thank you all very much.
Have a good night.
Do you want me to
Okay,
read the
and
next
yeah,
one?
let's read it again,
While
yeah.
Karen's prepping. All right, CEA Fresh Farms Project at State Road. Petitioners, Webster, where open space is worth preserving incorporated, and Webster Citizens for Appropriate Land Use are requesting an interpretation of the zoning code to determine if a proposed greenhouse farming operation is a permitted use in the large lot residential zoning district, whether or not R3 lot coverage restrictions would apply under section 225-11 sub B sub 2, section 225-73 sub D, section 225-108 sub D sub 1, and section 225-108 sub E sub 2 sub A of the Code of the Town of Webster, and pursuant to Monroe County Supreme Court Order Index E 2019-011898 dated May 18th of 2020.
Okay. Okay, now, we closed the public portion of the meeting on this. So at the last meeting, there's quite a bit of discussion amongst the board, and we actually called the meeting because it was getting late. So we've had a couple weeks to think about this. One of the points that I'd just like to make before we start is that, we have, this for the public too, we have a sheet with area variance standards set forth by the state of New York, and we have use variance standards set forth by the state of New York. Nobody's asking for a variance here. What they're asking for is an interpretation of the code. So these standards, just put them aside and interpret the code for what it says. Because we're not, if I say anything out of line, I wish you'd step in. But the point is, we can't let the standards be at the forefront of our mind. We have to interpret the code for what it is, okay? Now, if they come in for a variance in the future, then the standards kick in. But right now, we're just interpreting the code, okay? So I just want to make that point before we get started in our discussion. Okay.
Well, in the technical series zoning board publication that I think we've all received at some point in time during our board tenure does cover interpretations as part of the responsibility of the zoning board of appeals, is in the thought process that the board is required to go through in order to provide their interpretation of the code, where it's not painfully clear as to what may or may not have been intended as the code was written originally.
So the major points are, is this a permitted use in the large lot zoning? If it is the lot coverage 20% per R3, or is that not the case? Those were the two major issues, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
I believe so.
Yes.
So,
The second issue, just to, I guess, further define what the chair just said, is whether or not those standards apply. Not necessarily a given that they do apply, and then you go to determine what lot coverage issues involve.
okay.
Right, the first issue is this a permitted use? And then it's an A and a B, or an if-then type of question. So if, yes, it is a permitted use, then does this
Exactly.
conditions of R3 apply for this application and any future application?
So, that being said, what we need to do is discuss whether or not it's a permitted use and hopefully come to a consensus, or maybe we won't. Maybe we'll have a couple votes one way or a couple votes another, we don't know. But that's why we're here tonight. One of the things that people struggled with is the word customary farming. And what bothers me a little bit is that in the definition of agriculture and farming, they did have exclusions. You can't grow fur, you can't have fur-bearing animals, you can't have this, you can't have, they have four, but in nowhere does it limit the size of greenhouses. And I was looking for that. I'm looking for through the code book, and nowhere does it limit that. And that concerns me. Because they specifically don't allow this, this, and this, but they don't say they don't allow a greenhouse over a certain size. So that's what concerns me about, about denying, because I'm wondering where in the code does it say you can't do that?
Well, I think it boils down to the definition of customary within the section 225-73. And going through the basis of the interpretation, I'm just going to read a couple of excerpts from this because otherwise I'll ramble and it'll be much shorter.
Let's make sure that we're indicating what you're reading from specifically.
From the Zoning Board of Appeals, James A. Kuhn, Local Government Technical Series, which is handed out at the zoning board training classes that we get, discussing the creation, the function, the powers, and the duties of the Zoning Board of Appeals as a quasi-judicial body.
So let me just, because I don't have the document in front of me, and am not necessarily aware of what it says. So there are I guess bodies of work, for lack of a better description, that are what we call secondary sources. Places that, and I say that lawyers go to because really what's happening today is all five of you are acting as quasi-lawyers, if you will, because you're being asked to interpret a statute and make arguments to convince your colleagues that your interpretations are correct. So when we take a look at secondary sources, it's not a substitute for the Webster Code, but it is there to help us interpret or understand what we believe the code states when we're in a circumstance that the code is not precisely clear, as opposed to bending the code or interpreting the code in such a way to meet a particular position that we want to take with respect to the overall project. And I think that's what the chair was indicating at the outset, and I had indicated last time, that you really gotta leave your opinions about that part of it outside
Yes.
this room and strive to put your arms around what the code says, or in the event that it's not clear enough to say that what those that drafted it were intending it to mean. So with that, go ahead.
It goes through the basis of an interpretation that the Court of Appeals has held that a zoning board of appeals performs quasi-judicial function. It goes through, should act according to its own precedent. Where there are no prior decisions to rely on, the Board of Appeals should attempt to determine the governing board's original intent in enacting the provisions in question. In arriving at the determination, the board should consider prior documentation such as minutes of governing board meetings, testimony of local officials, planning advisory documents which may have been accompanied the enactment. Case law may also furnish guidance, goes through several other examples, and then basically when all else fails, where the case calls for the Board of Appeals to interpret the meaning of a term and there is no precedent to guide the board, it may refer to one of the various zoning treatises containing standard definitions or terms, even to the dictionary. So it basically, if there's nothing else that we can use, we need to come up with to go to sources to come up with customary definitions, and then look at what the code says, and then we can't necessarily infer from the code, but looking at what the code says and what the intention of the code is, based on what is in the various sections of the code, and trying to come up with a logical conclusion based on that.
One of the questions we had last meeting is that this 225-73 was added to the code quite a bit after the original definition of farming. And this was added to allow for agriculture in all zones because it wasn't allowed in commercial or industrial. So I don't know, my thought is, I don't know that the word customary changes the original intent of agriculture, because it was added at a later date with respect to commercial and industrial. But we're not looking at commercial or industrial, we're looking at LL.
But when I look at the definition of agricultural use, and this is the engineer in me, so bear with me that I've been living ISO standards my whole life and documentation for audits. But the agricultural use defines what is and is not allowed, and then it says to see section 225-73, which to me, the engineer, means that that is additional information that is now part of this definition. And then when we go to that, I don't know how we determine what sections of that we disregard. Because it doesn't say that the terms are intended only for agricultural use in a residential zone, or only for an agricultural use in a commercial zone, or it doesn't say that .1 is only intended if it's located here, .7 is if it's intended in a different zone. That the code does not delineate which zones the different segments of that section 73 apply to. But based on how it's written here, and I went through all of the definitions in the code just to see where else they may have referred to anything like that, and the other ones say refer to this for requirements, and or this was added or this was modified. This is the only section where it says to please go to this section, which if it were in my manufacturing background, you would go to that section and that would be the additional definition of that process or that manufacturing plan.
Yeah, and to your point, Mr. Barone, I don't think it changes the definition so much as adds to it by saying, okay, yeah, this is the definition that we had back in '68 when this section was written for the definition of agricultural use. But now we want to come back in and say, okay, now we're adding 22573, which, you know, tries to illuminate the point to some extent as well. So that's where section F and the word customary start to come in. And what is customary? I mean, greenhouses are obviously allowed, but is it a customary use of greenhouses?
Well, we did have a letter from the State Department of Agriculture that says it's indeed agriculture. They didn't use the word customary or any other word to describe it. They just said it's agriculture. Actually, let's put it this way. We heard from counsel from both sides, and as Mr. DeMarco said, they take a sentence or a word and they argue it to their advantage, obviously. Very eloquently, I might add. But, you know, it's up to us to determine. It comes down right here to us. And
Oh, agree.
there's nobody else to back us up. It's just, we have to make a decision.
Right.
And maybe, I'd like to hear from everybody.
I'm stuck in customary too. Time frame, I think, is critical in this, because you can't approve or disallow something that didn't exist in a definition when the word was used. I mean, when this word was put in this section, this 225-73, customary meant a particular something. You talk, when you say greenhouses at this time, everybody imagined what a greenhouse looked like. Now fast forward to 2020, a greenhouse means something entirely different, and that would be part of the definition today. But back when this customary was put in this code, I think customary and the size and scope of what a greenhouse was something that was a given. I mean, because they didn't, these greenhouses that we're talking about that are going to go on this development didn't exist. You can't disallow something that didn't exist. I think if you were going to write this code section today, you might pick and choose your words differently, or at least define what customary meant. So that's my 2 cents.
I agree with what Bob said. Depending on when in time is very critical. What's customary 30 years ago may not be customarily today.
Well, and is it customary based on the area, customary based on the globe? If I pull out the definition from Merriam-Webster or from the American Heritage Dictionary, customary is commonly practiced or used as a matter of course, usual, based on custom or tradition rather than written law or contract. And then the other definition is commonly practiced, used, or observed. And the example is customary acts of courtesy, customary enthusiasm. So if I look at, am I looking at customary that someplace in New Zealand this application is used? Or if I stand actually anywhere in the town of Webster, but in this particular large lot area in the town of Webster, and look around, is customary farming, or customary agriculture, or customary greenhouse, a 30-foot tall, 7-acre glass enclosed building. And I'm not saying what is or is not, but I'm just, you know, when I visit that site and I look around, customary agriculture is dirt farming. But this is stripping the dirt from the site, paving it and putting up these, I guess I'm gonna call it a grow factory just based on the volume of it. But I don't know, is that customary, is that not customary? That's for the board to determine. I think we all have,
Well, let me interrupt you again. It's only for the board to determine if the board determines that customary is something that you need to determine.
and I think
Okay,
that
so-
several of us have already come to that.
I don't know that to be the
conclusion.
case.
It's been
I'm just cautioning you that you need to make that determination first.
Correct.
And then, I think really under these circumstances, you would need to, or I would strongly recommend that the board make a record as to why they made that determination, not simply conclusory that they've chosen to do that. Because there should be a basis in the record if the decision is challenged as to why it was that you determined that customary is applicable under this application.
Well, let me take a swag at that then. Given what we've got in the definitions at the beginning of 225 and where it then goes to modify the definitions of agricultural use by applying 225-73 subsection F.
Okay, let me just stop you there. When you say modify, why do you think it modifies and doesn't simply just add
Or,
the
adds or eliminates.
qualification of customary as it relates to other zoning districts?
Because this doesn't specifically say customary in industrial zones or customary in, it just says customary across the board.
Right, so when the law requires that these statutes be strictly construed and that the term agricultural use stands alone in 225-12, how do you go away from that?
Because at the end of the agricultural definition in 225-12, it states see section 225-73.
As it relates, not as a standalone, but as it relates to all other, what's the word, all other,
Customary agricultural operations or farming.
all others conducted in all zones. So that's what I tried to indicate at the last meeting was, you've got to take the sentence in its entire context. You can't take a word out, take it in a vacuum, and then apply it someplace else. So again, when we're stating our reasons, is it really a modification, or is it an additional expansion based upon the context of other zones? In other words, is it qualifying it as to commercial zones and other zones, or is it truly a modification of how agricultural uses are defined under 225-12?
I would argue the latter, that it is a modification, that it's basically saying, here's the original definition. Now we're saying see section 225-73 in this specific instance, subsection F, and it says customary agricultural operations or farming may be conducted in all zones. So it's not saying all zones, we're now adding industrial and commercial. It's saying customary agricultural operations or farming may be conducted in all zones. So at that point, I'm saying, okay, here's our definitions of an agricultural use, but now we're saying customary agricultural uses. We're not going so far as to say, well, my son and I rode out to Alcut, and we're looking at, there were some of the very large beef operations out there where they're covered acres of, barns, all one giant barn. In fact, that would not be customary, certainly not in the town of Webster. This is a major,
Right, so does that mean then that the reverse is true? that now all other agricultural operations in Webster are also subject to customary use only.
All other applications in the town of Webster currently are customary. There aren't any that are of this magnitude on a single parcel.
And we've always grandfathered in things that were already pre-existing. So new codes don't apply to old developments.
All right, so when we talk about Mr. Snyder's position, if you will, and Ms. Vullo's I'm sorry?
It's Volo.
Volo, I'm sorry, Ms. Volo's statement relative to these secondary sources, the governing board, which in this case, of course, would have been the town board, and its minutes and reasons for adding this bracketed language. Have anybody looked, or did we had any of that information before us?
I didn't.
Suppose we look at section 225-2, the purpose of the section 225 zoning code, which is the section prior to the definitions.
I'm sorry, 225?
225-2,
Purpose.
the purpose. And I can read it into the record if you would like. I think everybody has a copy of it.
Please do.
The town board enacts this chapter for the purpose of promoting the public health, safety, morals, and general welfare of the town of Webster in accordance with the general intent of a comprehensive plan designed to lessen congestion in the streets, to secure safety from fire, flood, panic, or other dangers, to provide adequate light and air, to prevent the overcrowding of land, to avoid undue concentration of population, and to facilitate the adequate provision of transportation, water, sewerage, schools, parks, and other public requirements, and guided by the character of the district and its peculiar suitability, for particular uses, with a view to conserving real property values and encouraging the most appropriate use of land throughout the town. So it references the comprehensive plan, which I think we have all read, and that the purpose of the code is to define the uses such that we don't, I'm going to say overuse, but that's probably not the right word I should use, overuse any zoned areas. So, you know, the large lot, if we look at the beginning of...
Well, let me just interrupt you there. The question that I raised was in the context of Mr. Snyder's statement as to interpreting what the town board had discussed with respect to this additional use of the word customary.
Okay, for
And
the...
obviously what you're reading from was way before that happened.
Right, it's just the intent of...
So on that score, have we had any of that to supplement your decision-making? And does it exist? Anybody aware of that?
Don't know.
Okay. I mean, that could be, of course,
It may, but
a resource.
That could be a key.
It's in a box someplace.
What the intent was, if we had- Do those records exist? You know? You were there. No? I'm just giving you.
We talked about last time we were here, the approximate date and time that happened, did we not?
Yeah, when was this added
We
to the
tried
code?
to get a timeline, and I asked Mr. Benway to a little brown book, because I know there's an agricultural section in that brown book, which was good to 1969, the old town code book, which was brown. So that's what I'm referring, and I never received any answer from Mr. Benway on that.
I've got a note, but I don't know where the note came from, that Article 9, the supplementary regulations were added in 2010.
Yeah, that's on the, I
Yeah,
think
that's at the bottom.
Right, Article 9, that's where that's, page, it's at the top of 22569, but you're correct.
Okay.
That's
Well,
what we said last
we're
time.
trying to figure out the history of.
Why?
Yes.
And I would argue that that book probably didn't even include the word customary, because prior to 1969, I don't think there was a need to actually use the word customary in reference to farming or agricultural development.
No, I don't think there's any debate that that's not defined in the code. And that's,
Right.
again, I think that's a two-part analysis. A, whether you think that it applies at all, and if you do, what does it mean?
Well, that's what we're here for, right? To find out whether or not this project is even permitted on this parcel? That's what we're trying to discuss?
Well, we're interpreting the code.
Let me just read for everybody's, because people are watching this at home as well, the definition of agricultural use. The use of land and buildings in the raising of or production of agricultural products and nursery stock, flowers, and greenhouse products, but which shall not include raising of pigeons, swine, goats, foxes, minks, skunks, and other like fur-bearing animals except domestic animals, nor shall it include retail sales of any products not grown on the premises, such as garden or flower equipment, tools, or supplies. And that's, and then it says C 225-73. But that's what concerned me is that
Can you
it
speak
does
up
have
a little bit?
exclusions in here.
I can barely hear you, they can hear you.
You couldn't hear?
I
I think
I'm sorry.
what I was trying to make is that there's exclusions right in the agricultural code, but there is no exclusion for the size of a greenhouse. It says there's no exclusion for the size. This is all about the size of the greenhouse. That's what it comes down to.
Well, I don't know
Like I
that
said,
it's necessarily
I don't think you
just
can
about
exclude
the
something that
size.
didn't exist. I mean, you can't look in the future and say, well, we're gonna exclude the size and scope of what a greenhouse can be, because in 2020, they're gonna build these massive greenhouses. Customary then was what every single greenhouse on every single farm was. So you can't exclude something that didn't exist. You could today, but you can't when the code was written, and the use of that word.
And also, this isn't just about the size of the greenhouse, this is about artificial illumination, and various other things that, a earlier use, the 1968 definition of greenhouse, if you looked at what was going on around town and in the world in general maybe, greenhouses, if it was the size of this room, that was a big greenhouse. The fact that things have scaled up so much to this plan, it doesn't matter that the size of the greenhouse isn't necessarily enumerated in the code. Is this now a customary greenhouse use?
Again, that is assuming that each board member collectively feels that customary is applicable. Maybe that's what the board needs to determine. I mean, I would assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, if we were to take a poll of the board, that whether or not this is an agricultural use under 225.12, before you get to the word customary, everybody's on board that it's an agricultural use, or not necessarily so.
What is agricultural?
Yeah, it would be agricultural in nature.
Okay. So the next focus then needs to be whether or not you believe that the customary use language, as was it 73, 225.73?
Yes.
Is applicable to 225.12 subdivision 6, agricultural uses. And you have to determine that there is a need to go beyond what's required. That is that ambiguity in the language used in zoning regulations must be resolved in favor of the property owner. because zoning regulations on derogation of the common law, they must be strictly construed against the municipality which has enacted and seeks to enforce them. So you need to be clear that there's ambiguity as created by the language in the statute. If you find that that's the case, you have the right to stop your analysis right there, or you have to get to part two of the question, which is, what is customary?
Okay, following your line of logic, it sounds to me like what you've just read, New York State law, it's more in tune with when a property owner is at odds with the municipality. Not, in other words, if the code is ambiguous, the municipality says you cannot build that there, in that instance, state law finds in favor of the landowner.
Yeah,
But they're not at odds with the municipality right now. In other words, you follow my logic?
well, I mean, the applicant believes that this is permitted use, period, end of discussion. Common law says that, in general, people have the right to use their land as they would like. And if the municipality is going to prescribe against certain uses, they have the obligation to be crystal clear in what can or cannot be done, because if it's not crystal clear, then the ambiguity is determined in favor of the landowner.
I don't have anything else to add, so if you want to call for the vote, I'm ready to vote. Unless there's something else that we haven't discussed already.
Mr. Deneau, just because I brought up the possibility of getting a consensus in this pre-vote, are you referring to what I said?
No. I understand that it's the obligation of this board to come up with a definition of whether or not this project is allowed based on the code that we're looking at. And there's varying opinions, and I understand the developer's definition and what he feels, and I understand the opposition, and it's up to the board to find out and to make a decision about whether or not this project should go forward in this zone, and then we have further to talk about coverage if we vote in favor. Correct?
There's a consequence to the decision that the board makes,
Always is.
clearly, right? But the charge of the board here is to interpret the language of the code.
I understand, and we've talked about the language, the time frame, the reference to whether or not this adds to the definition or doesn't add to the definition. I understand what you're saying.
Okay. Does everyone else finish with discussion?
Yeah, I'm fine.
I get a pretty good sense of what the board members are thinking.
Mr. Hausen, are you finished with discussion?
Sure.
Okay, well, I guess at this point, if someone has a motion in mind for or against, the only way to bring this to a conclusion is to vote and see where it goes.
I'm trying to think of how to structure a motion.
Yeah,
Well,
and we're only looking at the Part A originally.
yeah, don't think about lot
Not
coverage
worried
at this
about lot
point in
coverage at
time.
this point in time, or any of the R3 conditions.
So you can make a motion, and if it's not seconded, then the motion's dead. Or you can make a motion, it's seconded, and then it goes to a board vote.
Right.
But
The question is, how do I word this motion?
we're
What do
not
you think?
granting an area variance or granting a use variance.
I would say whether or not the project
Struggling with the
is allowed in the zone that they're proposing it.
Okay, so I'll make a motion to make an interpretation that the use proposed is not permitted pursuant to Town Section 225-12 agricultural uses with reference to 225-73 subsection F, that being that this is by no means customary within the town of Webster and therefore would not be allowed in a residential area.
To be clear on the motion, is that motion in favor or to disallow the development?
My motion would be that this development is not permitted in this zone.
Okay, so implicit in Mr. Snyder's motion is that 225-73 subdivision F is applicable as it relates to the applicant's, as it relates to this application.
Correct.
Yes. Well, do we, well, yeah, would it be just F or it's all conditions in 225-73, but F is the contentious one?
Well, the other ones relate to lot coverage and R3 zoning.
Which we're not doing.
And if this board determines that it's not allowed use, there's no need to go there. If the board finds that it is an allowed use, then we have to take the next step and see, and see if those other R3 zoning restrictions or requirements apply.
All right. I will second Mr. Schneider's motion.
We have a second. Good call, roll.
Okay. Mr. Snyder?
Aye.
Mrs. Volo?
Aye.
Mr. Hauser?
Can you get back to me?
Mr. Denoto?
To clarify, this is to not allow, because of the wording in section 225-73F.
Correct.
It's not all?
Well,
Aye.
Let me just stop you, Mr. Denoto, before you vote. I suppose, Mr. Snyder, your application, I guess, is somewhat lean. We talked about that your position is that the word customary applies. I suppose you should state on the record those facts that exist in the record that you believe this application is not customary.
Okay. Let's see. I may actually have to write all this down then.
Take your time, it's important.
If he has to restate his motion, do we have to revote? Is he going to reread the motion?
Amend his motion.
He's going to amend it?
Obviously, those reasons should be supported by the testimony and all the documentation and discussions that were had.
Right. So we would refer to the definition within the code and then the definition of customary per Merriam-Webster.
You can certainly use the Webster dictionary definition, because that would be the only definition that I'm aware of. But to the extent that that definition calls for other conclusions, those should be supported by proof and data in the record.
Motion so amended?
So,
We're in the middle of a vote, right?
Well, I don't think the motion has changed, but the basis upon which the motion
Just to give it
is
further
made is going to be
definition.
developed.
He more or less has to elaborate on his reasoning.
Right.
Okay. So I'm voting. Aye.
Well, I'm struggling to try to wrap all of our previous discussion into one motion.
Well, talk it out. What you need to do is, you're using section F,
Mm-hmm.
but I think what you need to do is just elaborate on the testimony we heard and why you think customary doesn't apply, doesn't apply to this particular greenhouse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm getting pretty close. I just want to get everything in here. Could probably use a word processor right about now. Because I'm trying to be concise, because if I go back and say, I can get into an endless loop here where I'm saying, okay, this is customary being, and here's an example of what's customary, and now we just go round and around and around with that. So,
I think you're gonna have to reread it into the record anyways.
We,
mhm.
we need to establish that 22573
F.
is, 73 in general is considered part of the definition in section 3. And that
Right.
as part of that definition, F cannot be excluded.
Mm-hmm.
And then, based on the definition of customary, and I believe it would have to be customary within the town of Webster, and specifically the large lot zoning section of the town of Webster. Customary agriculture does not include significantly large factory greenhouses. The greenhouses are I can visualize the ones that are on the corner of Whiting and Clem. That is a traditional Webster greenhouse within a large lot zoning district.
There aren't a lot of them in Webster.
Ms. Volo, which dictionary did you?
Merriam-Webster and the American Heritage Dictionary both give the same definition.
Is this like a court writing an opinion?
getting to that
We need a
point.
typewriter.
I think what might be appropriate at this point is, why don't you, I would recommend that you withdraw the motion and remake the motion in total, once you're ready to go.
Okay, well, I am actually, I put my final thought on there just as you spoke that, so,
All right, and we want to make sure that your motion is based upon, articulated and identified testimony, proof in the record upon which your conclusions or your motion is based.
right.
Okay?
Yeah, I think I've got it. So I'll withdraw my previous motion with the mind to make a new one. I will make a motion to interpret the code that section 225(3) agricultural uses definition is modified, referring to section 225(73). Customary is determined to include non-illuminated, not artificially heated greenhouses such as were in use in the town as of 2010, when section 225-73 was added, and as commensurated in the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of customary uses. And that with such interpretation, the proposed use for the CEA grow farm is not permitted in this area.
Second.
Okay, Mr. Snyder?
Aye.
Mrs. Volo?
Aye.
Mr. Hauser?
Aye.
Mr. Denoto?
Aye.
Mr. Barone?
Nay. Okay. That concludes. All right, we're all set. That was a tough one. Thank you, everybody, for your patience and respectful behavior. I appreciate it.
Bear with me before we do the next one.
Are we still on, or are we on? We've got one more minute.
We've got one more application.
I'm looking forward to doing area variance.
A good old-fashioned area variance.
Good old-fashioned area variance, yeah.
All right. I have to find it. Bear with me.
Read that into the record, please.
All right. Okay.
Nice job on that amended motion, Eric.
Pardon?
Nice job on that. You covered everything, I think.
Oh, thank
Mostly
you.
everything.
Yeah, once I have to start writing it down, then I have to think.
All right. The first scheduled matter of this evening is 954 Gaywood Lane, addition and front porch, located at 954 Gaywood Lane. Applicant Ashley Barth is requesting area variances to allow for a 10-foot side setback where 15 feet is required associated with the construction of an addition to the principal residence under section 225-11B sub 5 sub B sub 1 of the Code of the Town of Webster. B, a 29-foot front setback where 50 feet is required associated with the construction of a front porch under section 225-11B sub 5 sub A of the Code of the Town of Webster on a .5 acre parcel having SBL number 079.13-2-5 located in an R3 single-family residential district.
Could you state your name and tell us about your project, please?
Yes, I'm Ashley Barth. We're just looking to put an addition on our house. It's extending out of the back side of the house for the most part, but what we are looking to add on the side that's going closer to our neighbor's home, well, it won't be closer to our neighbor's home, it's going the second floor above our existing living room. That is currently 10 feet away from our property line. It was there when we bought the house 6 years ago. So I guess what we're looking to do is just extend the second floor over that and then replace the current front steps. I have pictures, I don't know if you guys have them in front of you, of what the current steps look like and measured out roughly what we're looking to do to replace that.
These are the pictures.
Yes. And that would be replaced with, we're hoping to replace with like a sitting area patio that would be flush with where the brick goes, and it goes over to the driveway and out only as far as, I think it's 10 feet, as shown in the one picture, which would only go maybe a foot further than the current walkway.
So would it be at the level of the upper step and then step down towards the driveway?
So yes, it'll be at the level of the upper step, and then the stairs onto the patio would be from the driveway.
Okay. Thank you for providing the pictures with the tape measure. That is perfect. It's so helpful.
Now, the side setback is, that house has got to be 60, 70, 80 years old, and that's been the side setback.
Yeah.
You're just adding up on top of that, and that's the reason for that variance, so there's really not anything you've done to create that 10-foot side setback.
That's just pre-existing non-conformance.
Nice.
Yep. How wide was the deck? I'm sorry, you probably already said it. How wide was the deck?
It comes out 10 feet and it's 17 feet long.
From the existing patio over to the driveway, 17 feet.
From the existing house out.
Oh,
Yeah, I don't want those pink steps anymore.
yeah.
They're charming.
Yeah.
A lot of people are putting these decks on the front of their house. It's kind of,
Well, visiting the site, I think the neighbor to the south won't come any closer to the road than what the neighbor has to the south of this proposal.
Yeah, I think what people are finding is that when they go to try to replace this kind of concrete work, it's actually easier to build a deck kind of thing. My daughter's house actually has that, where the concrete crumbled away, so they just built a deck and left it sitting underneath.
well, I visited the site, and the concrete is dangerous right now.
Yeah. And with
It's
three little
actually
boys.
dangerous to walk on, it's falling apart.
Yeah, it's
falling
sagging
apart.
and.
And the narrowness of the lot really doesn't apply to the front setback, which is probably the more contentious issue, but given the size of the proposed deck compared to what's already in existence there in terms of hard surfaces, and given the neighborhood, as Mr. Hauser pointed out, it's pretty much normal anymore. So,
Now, I didn't say, I didn't mean to interrupt.
no, that's all right. I actually stopped.
No intention to cover the deck, right, with a roof or anything?
What was that? I'm sorry.
No intention to cover that deck with a roof in the future?
No, I don't want an
That-
awning.
That's
I want it
important
open.
because that changes the whole look of the structure.
Yeah,
Okay.
I don't want it covered. We just want it open so that we can sit out front when our kids are playing. But no, I don't want an awning or anything like that on the front.
I might point out, if they put a patio there, no variance would be required. But, so, and it's gonna serve really the same purpose. Looking at the picture, the deck's only gonna be about a foot off the ground, so it's not gonna be very obtrusive or conspicuous.
Okay.
Yeah. This meeting's open to the public, for anyone who wishes to speak for or against it. Our phone line is 872-7011.
Can I just say one thing too? You said a foot off the ground. We're gonna go level with the steps or the front door that's currently there. I just want to make sure that that was
That's
noted.
fine.
Okay, so it won't be a tiny step down, it'll just be a continuous.
So we're planning on doing steps from the driveway up, and then it would be flush with where the front door is.
Which,
Okay.
will actually make much more sense, because now they're all substandard height steps, which is awkward.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the steps are too big, yeah.
And you may want to reconsider that because your snow is going to pile up, so when you open your front door,
Well, that's a
You-
point.
there again, it's something to consider.
Talking about the snow months,
Oh, on the front step?
if
Yeah.
it's level with your front door, something to consider.
I mean, even if you get 1 or 2 inches, it's going to be in your house.
Yeah. I would lower it a little
So
bit,
consider the step
just from
down?
experience. Okay, being in every event, I'll make a motion pursuant to NYCR 617.5 of the Environmental Code, I'll make a motion for type 2 seeker.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
I don't think anyone's going to call in, so I'll close the public portion of the meeting. How's that? Yeah, Catherine reminds me. I'll tell you what, I visited the site, got 3 little boys, a couple dogs, and I don't know why you put this in there, you say I got a husband with big feet, but I'm not sure what so that was actually in the application, so he came out, he's
Yeah,
a
it's
big
an
guy, about
interesting
6'6". So I'll run through the standards. It's, the one variance is not even, it's a pre-existing condition, 10-foot side setback. They're going 2 stories, but they're not going out any further to the side, so it's still a 10-foot side setback. So that's really of no significance whatsoever. As far as the front porch, the homes up in that neighborhood are all closer to the lot. They got huge, deep lots, but they built the houses up close to the road. I'm not sure why, but it is what it is. So it's not out of character with the neighborhood. There is no detriment created nearby properties. The benefit really is not achievable by any other method. The front porch is the front porch. You want to sit out front, watch the kids in the driveway riding their bikes up and down the street. It's not substantial. As I said, the deck is quite low. It's pretty inobtrusive. They're not going to put a roof over it, which would make it look like a massive structure, which we would probably not really approve of. The difficulty is not self-created. They're remodeling their home and they're trying to make it as livable as possible, and it's not undesirable change. So with that, anybody have anything you could add to that?
No.
Okay. I'd like to make a motion to grant an area variance at 954 Gaywood Lane for 10-foot side setback where 15 feet is required, associated with the construction of an addition to the principal residence under section 225-11, sub B, sub 5, sub B, sub 1 of the Code of the Town of Webster, and a 29-foot front setback for the deck where 50 feet is required, associated with the construction of front porch under section 225-11, sub B, sub 5, sub A of the Code of the Town of Webster, on a .5 acre parcel having SBL number 079.13-2-5, located in R3 Single Family Residential District.
Second.
Okay, Mr. Barone?
Second.
I'm sorry.
Aye.
Okay, Mr. Barone?
Aye.
Mrs. Volo?
Aye.
Mr. Hauser?
Aye.
Mr. Schneider?
Aye.
Mr. Denoto?
Aye.
Okay, just a couple conditions. It's good, the variance is good for 1 year, meaningful construction within 1 year. I know you're anxious, so you're probably going to get going right away. And you need to get a building permit from the Town of Webster Building Department. All right. Congratulations.
Thank
Good
you.
luck with your project.
Thank you so much.
Good luck.
And that concludes tonight's meeting. We'll see you, now we're going, what, July 14th, is it? I believe it's July 14th. We had canceled that meeting, but we brought it back online because we had so many applications. So we'll see you on July 14th. Thank you for watching.